Okay, I'm back, and let's talk about how our sensory memory system works. It's not like muscle memory. You may have been told that you have muscle memory and that that's really referring to procedural memory. That's motor memory, where your muscles, it's not that your muscles remember, it's that your cerebellum takes care of that automatic process if you just let it go, right? If you let your cerebellum take over, then your body will be able to do what it's supposed to do. If you think about it, you might interfere with that kind of what they call muscle memory. But it's not really your muscles, it's your cerebellum. It's a procedural memory. What I'm talking about with sensory memory is your actual sense organs hold information briefly. So in the case of eyes, you have iconic memory that stores, input, that little brief light wave information that is your visual information for about half a second, about 500 milliseconds long. And they know that because in research they've had people, they flash an array of letters, and if they can verbally report what they saw in less than 500 milliseconds, they can say them all. But if it takes longer than that to say it all, it fades out. And they go, oh, I forgot the last few, right? Because it goes too fast. Only about half a second. If you think about it, it makes a lot of sense that you have half a second, because if you were to see something and close your eyes, you can kind of visualize it long enough to maybe think about it to transfer it into the next stage of memory. So it gives you a second, half a second, to decide to pay attention to information before it fades away or gets replaced by some other visual input. Echoic memory refers to your auditory memory. You've probably had this experience where you heard something and it kind of bounces around in your ear for like 4 to 5 seconds, and you have a chance to kind of reflect on it. Sometimes I do that when I'm lecturing, because I'll say something, stop to think, and I'll say, I think I said the wrong word. That's not the word I meant to say, but I had to wait until, hear the playback, right? But it's the actual auditory cues kept popping around in my cochlea. Give me a second to reflect. Haptic memory refers to your touch memory. And your skin receptors will continue to process that information of touch for about a second after it happened. So after somebody has touched your arm and then removed their hand, you have about 1 second where you're still feeling that pressure. That's your haptic sensory memory. We don't have names for taste and smell because they don't work quite the same way, because being chemical senses, those molecules are still actually present. And so it's hard to make them go away and see if you can still detect the taste, right? Because those molecules lodge into those receptor sites and they are there. You can't make them go away once they're in there. So it's a little harder to test the duration of taste and smell sensory memories, but we definitely think that information is held briefly in your nose and on your tongue also. All right, let's talk a little bit about that short-term memory store, and I'll try and keep separate my conversation about short-term and then what we mean by working memory when we're saying these things. So I'm going to talk about short-term. The short-term memory capacity is about 7 plus or minus 2 individual items. These PowerPoints are available in the classroom, those of you who are my students. If you click on this, if you run these as an actual PowerPoint slide and then click on this link, you can go take a test of your short-term memory capacity, and it's pretty fun. You find out, oh yeah, it is 7 plus or minus 2 individual items. So the average person can remember between 5 and 9 items in their short-term memory before they max out. How fatigued you are will have an impact on how much you can remember. How much you've been trying to remember things might have fatigued just your memory system, things like that. So there are situational variations that we all experience, and then there are individual differences. Some of us have, slightly better memories, so we're going to be pushing it closer to the 9. Some of us are kind of not using our memories as much and stuff like that. We might be pushing it closer to the 5. But the idea is you can't store that much individual information in your short-term memory. So what a lot of us do is use some kind of chunking strategy, where we figure out a way to take items that are unrelated, tie them together so that now they're actually only one item, so it's a little easier to remember. So, for example, if I asked you to remember this list of individual letters, you'd be like, that's 12 and that's too much. But if I asked you to remember this series of 12 individual items, well, now they're 4 chunks, and it's a lot easier to remember. You might be like, what's that TWA one? And that's actually an old airline, Trans World Airlines, that went out of business. So that one may not be easy for you to remember. It might be that you remember that it's 2, intelligence agencies, a computer company, and something I've never heard of before. Right, now it's just 4 chunks, and now it's a lot more memorable. Short-term memory lasts about 30 seconds, and we know this from a couple of different angles. One way that we know this is when we look at, this is the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. They've done it, Ebbinghaus originally did it to himself. He taught himself a list of consonants and got to the point where he could remember them all perfectly. And then he would wait 33 seconds, test himself, and he realized, I only remember about 60% of the words that I originally knew all of them. By 18 seconds, on using a new list, by 18 seconds, he's like, I remember 1. That's it. That's all I got. So what we have is this learning curve. Now, since Ebbinghaus in the late 1800s discovered that learning curve on himself, or this forgetting curve on himself, lots of researchers have double-checked it with other people. And this is how memory seems to fade away out of short-term memory, that within 3 seconds, you've lost 60% of the material. You're down to 60% of the material. By 18 seconds, it's almost all gone. I earlier had mentioned 30 seconds because that's a good, safe, by 30 seconds, if you weren't thinking about the material, if you weren't doing maintenance rehearsal to keep it active, by 30 seconds, it's gone. You can't recall anything. By the way, to get this this forgetting curve to look like this, they prevented the participants from doing any kind of rehearsal. So, for example, you'd finish learning the words or the consonants, and you know them perfectly. And then for 3 seconds, you have to count backwards from 100 by 3s. Right? That's a cognitively challenging task. So we prevent you from rehearsing by asking you to do something in the meantime that would interfere with your working memory or your short-term consciousness. And so that's how we know that by 18 seconds, you've forgotten almost everything if you're not allowed to maintenance rehearse. The other way that we know that short-term memory is maybe as much as 30 seconds is from people who have had damage to their memory systems that prevents them from transferring new information into long-term memory. So all they have is a short-term memory store. People who have had that kind of damage, it usually comes from infections in the brain. You can't really get this kind of damage from like a blow to the head or something like that. Even though if you've seen 50 First Dates, they said she got in a car accident and then she had this kind of memory problem. That's not usually how you get it. The part of your brain that you rely on for this kind of memory is the hippocampus, and it's well cushioned inside your brain. So usually it gets damaged through some kind of infection or maybe seizure activity. So when I saw 50 First Dates, it was such a cute movie, and I really liked it, and I didn't want to be mad at them for not having depicted it correctly. So I decided that after her car accident, she had some seizures while she was in the hospital that they didn't tell us about, and that damaged her hippocampuses, and that's why she could not store new information. So if you ever watch the movie, that'll make it all make a lot more sense. But the idea is that every 30 seconds, I've forgotten everything that I was thinking about, what I was talking about at the beginning of my sentence, what you were talking about. So I ask you the same question over and over again and things like that. There was a case in England of a guy named Clive Waring, and he had an infection that damaged his hippocampuses. And so he had to live in an institution because he could not remember if he had already taken his medicine. He couldn't remember if he had turned off the stove. I mean, he couldn't remember anything. Every 30 seconds, it was like a brand new day for him. And so something that was really interesting is his journals, where he would write in his journals, I have just now regained consciousness, over and over and over again. And then he would cross out previous times that he had written that and then say, people's entries in my diary are rubbish and things like that. He knew that was his handwriting, but he knows he didn't write it because he just now regained consciousness. So clearly somebody's trying to play a prank on him. Every 30 seconds, it's brand new for him. And so his wife would come visit him in the institution, and he would be so excited to see her. He was passionately in love with his wife. She would walk in, and he was a classical pianist, and so he was very musical. And so she would walk in, and he'd be like, blah, so happy, and hug her, and just so excited to see her. And then she could go out in the hallway. She had to go to the bathroom, and she'd come back in his room, and he'd be like, oh, you're here. I haven't seen you in weeks. I'm so excited. I just regained consciousness. So excited. And he literally, from one 30-second moment to the next 30-second moment, could not remember anything. So that's how we know that short-term memory is no more than 30 seconds long if you don't have the opportunity to rehearse and think about the thing that you're thinking about. All right, speaking of rehearsal, let's talk about some of the effortful processes that you can use to transfer information into long-term memory so that you can try and remember material over the long term. Like, for example, stuff you might be studying for school. One way that you can try and remember things is through engaging in conscious repetition of the material, some kind of rehearsal. I'm going to try and argue that you shouldn't do that. So let's see if I can make my case. For one reason why you shouldn't do rehearsal is that when you're learning a list, for example, you tend to suffer from something called the next in line effect. When you know that there's another word on your vocabulary list, or if you know that there's another item coming up on your study guide that you're preparing for your introductory psychology class, the fact that you know that there's more detracts some of your attention from the one that you're working on right now. So you might have had this experience if you've ever been at some kind of event. It could have been school or maybe camp or something like that, where we're all new, and so we're all learning each other's names. And they'll put you like in a circle, and the first person introduces themselves, and then the next person introduces themselves and the person before them, right? So when it comes to me, I'm supposed to say, you're Johnny, and you're from Maple Valley. I'm Jill, I'm from Renton. The next person is supposed to say Johnny from Maple Valley, Jill from Renton, like that, and we're supposed to move around, right? So that when we finally get back to the end, the last person has repeated every single person's name, and we should know. What happens, though, is when Johnny says, I'm from Maple Valley, I know I'm next in line. So I'm like, okay, I'm Jill from Renton, and that's, oh no. It's one name. I'm the first person who has to remember something and report something. And I haven't had any opportunity for any kind of conscious repetition because I was busy worrying about, I live in the county. What city should I say I live in? I'm confused. I don't know. What's my name? These kinds of self-conscious thoughts that we have. And so we actually aren't processing the thing right before us, which is the one thing I had to remember, right? So it's always surprising when you go around that circle that it's the person right in front of you that you have the most trouble with. You might be able to remember every single person around the circle, and then you don't remember the person right next to you. I've been standing next to a friend in a circle like that and blanked on their name. I'm like, wait, I came here knowing you. That's the one name I knew. Still, I knew everybody else because I had time to rehearse, enough rehearsal, and the next in line, because I knew I was next, I blank on the person right in front of me. So next in line effect is describing how the fact that you know that there's another item coming, whether it's you or another item to memorize, something like that, it takes away some of your cognitive effort that you can place on the one that you're trying to process right now. Okay, now the spacing effect is something that if we were more aware of it, and if we took advantage of it, rehearsal would actually work better. The problem is we don't use the spacing effect when we're studying. If you're studying for class, the best thing you can do is space out your rehearsals. Do a little bit every day rather than a lot right before the exam. I have been teaching school long enough. As a student, I didn't take this advice. I mean, I don't blame anyone who doesn't space their rehearsal. I understand. But it's really dumb of us not to do it. And I say us because I do it too. I know that there's going to be some assessment of my knowledge coming up. And the easiest way to do well on that assessment of my knowledge is to do a little bit every day to get prepared. But I'll tell you what, I got a deadline looming in just a week and a half, and I'm doing this instead of preparing for that. So I know I know, but this is why I'm going to argue rehearsal is not our best strategy, because the very thing that would make it more effective is spacing out that rehearsal over time, practicing frequently over time, we don't want to do. And so if we don't want to do the thing that would make it work well, we probably shouldn't be doing rehearsal, and we should be doing something else. Another issue with rehearsal is that when we're provided with a list to try and memorize, let's say a vocabulary list or a list of material organized by chapter for you to prepare for your introductory psychology exam, if you try and study that material in the order it was presented in the list, you will tend to experience the serial position effect. I'm going to give you a little example, see if you experience this problem. So what I'm going to ask you to do is write down in any order the name, or you can even do initials if you want to go faster, of any American president, U.S. president that you can think of in any order. Go ahead and pause me and take a second to do that. Okay, so hopefully you wrote a little list. Hopefully you played along. If not, you should have, because it's kind of fun. In class, when I give students, I give them only 15 seconds to write down as many as they can, because I just want them to unload what's easy to unload out of their memories. And typically what we get is a really clear serial position effect. Let me show you the serial position of presidents. Usually, virtually everyone in class has written down George Washington. Almost everybody has done that. Depending on how recently there was an election, then we have, some number of students who will write down whoever is currently president. If there's been a recent change of presidents, a lot of times it takes a couple of quarters before people start to write down the current president. And it doesn't matter who it is. I've been doing this since 1993. So I've watched a lot of people write down a lot of things with different presidents. And so always whenever there's a transition, it's hard to remember who is currently in office. But usually we have an inordinate number of presidents that have been in office in the recent years. We'll always have Washington, a lot of times Jefferson. Almost everybody writes down Lincoln, and almost everybody writes down Kennedy. A lot of people will write down Roosevelt and then point out that's a twofer, right, because you've got two Roosevelts. If you wrote down Johnson, you actually get a twofer on that one also. Who else? If you wrote down Bush, you get a twofer on that. And technically, if you wrote down Adams, you get a twofer, but a lot of people don't write down any Adams, which is kind of funny. There was a biography of Adams that came out a few years ago, and for a little while, a lot of people were writing down Adams. But so sort of like what's popular at the moment will cause, like Madison all of a sudden started popping up, or Hamilton, So, wait, Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. Sorry, I went off on the wrong place. No, just Adams. Anyway, history is not my specialty. And a lot of times people will say, well, I don't know, those guys were all before me. Well, I know, but we all had some amount of history that we had to take, or those of you who are history majors, got to take. So why are we so bad at this? Well, we tend to remember the ones that were at the beginning, Washington, and for some reason Jefferson, a little less likely to do Adams for some reason. We tend to remember the recent things, right? So you may have written down Trump or Obama or Bush or Clinton. So we tend to remember the recent ones. We tend to remember the primary ones, the first ones, and we tend to have loss of the ones that are in the middle. I'll talk in a second about Lincoln and Kennedy and Roosevelt, because they're kind of in the middle, and yet we still remember them. What I wanted to direct your attention to is we're on the 45th president, so we should be looking at, let's look at the 23rd president, Benjamin Harrison. Okay, probably you didn't write him down unless you did a biography on him when you were in school or something, right? But let's look above and below Harrison. 22nd president was Grover Cleveland. 24th president was Grover Cleveland. That's unique. That is the only president who was president 2 separate times. How come we don't know that, right? My maiden name was Grover. I never knew that Grover Cleveland was president 2 separate times until I started looking at this chart. And back when Barack Obama was president, it drew my attention to Grover Cleveland, right, because he would have been exactly the middle of the list. I'm like, wait, why is he listed twice? What is this? I had no idea how unique he was. A lot of times people will say, well, Lincoln was really unique. Or people who got assassinated in office, Lincoln and Kennedy, that attracts your attention. Well, there are other people who got assassinated in office. Harding, right? Who else got assassinated? I think Polk might have gotten assassinated. Yeah. How about Zachary Taylor? He was president for like 1 year. What happened to him? Like, why don't we know these things? I thought uniqueness was supposed to attract our attention. It doesn't. We talk about Lincoln a lot. He's on the money. I mean, there's a lot of things that make him really distinct, not just having been assassinated. The Emancipation Proclamation, these kinds of things were big cultural things, and we talk about him a lot. And so I think that's what he's benefiting from. Same thing with Roosevelt. He gets talked about a lot. And I don't mean Theodore. I mean, it tripped me out that Theodore Roosevelt got to be on Mount Rushmore. I was like, what was that? But I guess he founded the National Park System. But Franklin D. Roosevelt, I mean, he was president for 12 years. That's pretty unique, and we talk about him a lot. So things that we encounter a lot, you can overcome the serial position effect, right? Rehearsal, lots of experience, spaced out experience, right? You've seen lots of different contexts. So like that can overcome the serial position effect. But in general, we don't do those kinds of things with the materials that were provided to try and learn for classes, to memorize for classes. So I'd like to argue against pure rehearsal when you're provided with a list. Oh, I marked who got assassinated. I forgot. I had the brilliance to do that. Okay, so Lincoln, obviously, and Kennedy, McKinley, and Garfield. Oh, Harding died. What did he die of? I thought he got assassinated too. Maybe he died after for some reason. I can't remember. People who died in office, maybe that would attract our attention. Not really. So what we say with the serial position effect is that if you're going to test the person immediately, and that's kind of what we're doing with presidents because we're living through the immediate part right now, you tend to remember the first things on the list. In the red line is what we're kind of experiencing with our knowledge of presidents. You remember the things at the beginning of the list, Washington. You forget most of the stuff in the middle, right? Grover Cleveland. And then you remember the things that have happened in your knowledge base, the recent events. So you put down, maybe Trump, Obama, and Bush, or something like that. If, on the other hand, you're being tested on a list sometime after the last time that you looked at the list, so like class materials, you've been given a vocabulary list to learn, and you studied it in the order provided, and you studied it over and over and over again, and you just did rehearsal, put the list away, go take your test. Typically, the items at the beginning of the list will benefit, and everything else will not do very well. So pretty much the middle of the list, no matter when the test occurs, always suffers. The end of the list suffers if there's a delay between your last rehearsal and your actual test. So hopefully these graphs make you think, maybe I need to do something else besides rehearsal. So what can you do instead? Well, this is actually something that I have spent 25 years researching, and I can tell you these are better research strategies. One is to process the information, what we call semantically. There are two different things that we mean by semantic. The first one is process the material for meaning. You may notice that I give a lot of examples while I'm lecturing. So I define something and I try and think of a TV experience or something from my life or something that students have told me that helps to bring to life that concept, right? What I'm trying to get you to do is process the material for meaning. Don't just memorize terms, but remember what they mean. Remember what they're describing, how they apply in real life. That's what we mean by semantic encoding. Process it for meaning and relate it to what you already know. So that's going to lead to what we call a deep processing. You're going to really attach the new material to things that you already have stored in your memory. And that's going to make it a lot more memorable when it's time to go look for it at retrieval. So deep processing, semantic encoding, here's an example. Let's say you're learning a vocabulary list. Maybe you're taking a foreign language and you need to remember the words. So maybe you generate a sentence, and each of the vocabulary words, your job is to decide whether the vocabulary word fits into the sentence. So let's say that in the language that you're learning, one of the words that you're supposed to memorize is whale. So would he met a whale in the street fit into the sentence? Like, does the meaning whale fit in with this context of being in the street? Probably in this context, we'd say no, because usually you don't meet a whale in the street. But, I mean, apparently sometimes they do move the carcasses of whales through city streets. So it's not impossible, but more than likely as you're going through your list, some of the words that you're memorizing fit into the sentence, some don't. But the idea is with semantic encoding is that you're really having to process what that word means, put it into context, make a judgment about it, tie it to things you already know, like what I know about how the world works. What's the likelihood of meeting a whale in the street? Pretty small. So I've really had to think about it. That makes it much more likely that I'll remember it later on. Even better than semantic is visual encoding. The dual coding hypothesis says that if we have two ways of thinking about the material, we have the name of the item, and then we also have this visualization that we've created. We have two ways to find the material when it's time to retrieve it, and it makes it more likely. It makes it more likely that it'll be successfully stored also, because maybe you'll forget the name of it, but you remember what it looked like. So dual processing refers to the fact that you have two ways of processing visual information, your automatic tendency to label visual things, and then also the visualization of it. So a lot of mnemonic devices take advantage of visual encoding of some sort. So let's start with the method of loci. This method was used by Greek orators who would give speeches that were hours long without any kind of notes. And they report that they used this strategy, the method of loci, to visualize moving through a street in the town, walking down the street, collecting the paragraphs that they need to deliver. If they ever forget part of their speech, they'll say, oh, I forgot to look behind the rock where I had stored that part of the speech, things like that. I don't know how to use this method for something abstract like that. So what I'm going to do is show you how you could use it for concrete objects, like a shopping list. I don't know about you guys if you've ever done the grocery shopping, but I forget my list quite frequently. And so being able to maybe memorize the items rather than writing them down would be really helpful. I thought I had a picture here. I think it's not showing. Hold on a second while I fix that real quick. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do is visualize the Brady Bunch kitchen with me, if you know it. Otherwise, you can use your own kitchen if you want, or your own house. Here's what we need if you're going to use a different location that you're more familiar with. You need a kitchen with some kind of seating area that you can use. You need to have a rug or some kind of carpet in the adjoining room where there's someplace to sit. You need stairs, and you need a bathroom and a bedroom. The bedroom needs to have a dresser in it. So if you can imagine some place that has those criteria, then that'll work instead. But for some reason, I learned this when I was in college, and for some reason, when my professor said, think of a two-story house, I didn't think of my own house. I thought of the Brady Bunch house for some reason. I don't know why I thought of that. So anyway, here's what we're going to do. We're going to visualize the items that we're going to buy so that we'll later be able to very easily generate this list when we get to the grocery store. So, and we're going to use this location to facilitate our memory. So we're standing in the kitchen. We look at those upper cabinets. One of the doors is open, and a waterfall of honey is cascading from those upper cupboards, pooling on that counter, running off the counter to the floor and running across the floor. So we have sort of this waterfall effect of honey. When we look at the table, instead of that a flower arrangement in the center of the table, there's a big salad bowl, and it's mounded up with kibble, dog kibble. And there's actually a dog with its hind legs on one of those chairs and its forelegs on the table, and it's eating the kibble out of the bowl. Now we go to the adjacent room, and in this house it has shag carpeting. And from the backer of the shag carpeting to the tips of the shag carpeting, it is completely embedded with sugar. So every step that you take, you can hear it as you walk across the carpeting. You look over at the couch that's in that room, and it's got little piles of oranges in the position where you would expect pillows, as if the oranges think they are the pillows, right? Little mounds of oranges on the couch. As you're walking up the staircase, instead of being carpeted, it's actually coated, like with rows of bread. So as you're walking up the stairs, you're stepping on bread where there would normally be carpet. You get upstairs, you go into the bathroom, and the bathtub is completely full of water, and floating in it are pork chops, raw pork chops floating around in the bathtub water. You go to the neighboring bedroom, and the top dresser drawer is open. A bottle of milk has tipped over on the top of the dresser, and all the items in that top dresser drawer are all floating around in the milk. Then you go over to the bed, you pull back the covers, and the bed is just full of potato chips, all this grease and crunched up potato chips and salt, and somebody's taken an entire bag of potato chips and just put it into that bed and then made the bed. All right, so now when we go to the grocery store, of course we've forgotten our list, but no worries, because we've got our method of loci. So we put ourselves back in that kitchen, we look at the upper cupboards, and that cues us to remember that we need honey. Then we look at the table, and we see that there's a big bowl of dog kibble on the table. Then we go into the living room, and we walk across the carpet, and it reminds us to get sugar. Then we look over at the couch, and it reminds us we need oranges. As we walk up the stairs, we go, oh, that's right, I need some bread. Upstairs bathroom, the bathtub reminds us we need pork chops. Go into the bedroom, the dresser reminds us we need milk. And then pull back the covers on the bed, and we are reminded chips. Now, of course, just like the orators used to say, if you forget to look in a spot, if you forget to go in the bathroom, you're going to come home without pork chops, right? Unless you go and you remember to look at all the things in your location, you're going to forget something. So it's not perfect. Memory's not perfect, but it's something that'll help you remember things. Now, some of you may have heard this called a memory castle. That became a common term for it recently, and there's a guy who does, I think, a TED Talk on it, or maybe he's just on YouTube. But it's a really nice way to remember, especially concrete items. I mostly can do it with concrete items. I don't do a very good job with anything abstract. Speaking of things that work best with concrete items, the peg word technique. In this technique, you actually memorize a list of peg words. So 1 is a bun, 2 is a shoe, 3 is a tree, 4 is a door, and so on. Now in class, I ask my students to shout out a concrete object that they want me to remember. And I have a student writing the words on the board behind my back, so I'm not rehearsing it through writing it or something like that. I'm just purely doing the peg word technique. And it's not a trick, it's a technique that really works. And so students will shout out things like, I oftentimes get pencil, for example. So my first peg word is bun. So my first, whatever word is said to me first, I have to try and think of a visualization of the word that I've been given, and then a bun. So 1 is a bun. I was told pencil, so I imagine the pencil is being a hot dog, and it's being held in a hot dog bun. So when I visualize that, when it's time for me to retrieve my list of words, I think 1 is a bun. My bun is a hot dog bun holding a pencil, so the first word I learned was pencil. The more outlandish the associations, the better. I can't tell you how often. It's really weird. I should start taking keeping track of it because it happens really frequently, that the second word I'm offered is shoe. It's really weird. Like, why are you offering me shoe? And now I've got two as a shoe, and you said shoe. It's like, no. How am I supposed to visualize that? So I'll have like a shoe wearing a shoe as my visualization. Very confusing. But the more outlandish the visualization, the better, the more memorable it'll be. So the numbers are telling you what position in the list the item is. So you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 in this list. The peg word is bun, shoe, tree, door, hive, sticks, and so on. As you're given an item to remember, you visualize an interaction between the word that you're trying to remember, the object that you're trying to remember, and that peg word. So 3 is a tree. If I'm offered, for example, apple, I get that all the time for 3 also. If I visualize apple, I might visualize an apple tree. But you know what? That's the kind of visualization that you might make a mistake with. Because when it's time to retrieve it, you're already thinking tree because you know it's number 3 on the list. You're thinking tree. And then you forget it's something as mundane as an apple tree. So you want it to be something vivid that you can visualize. So your job is to put the effort in while you're making the visualization between the peg word and the thing that's going to be remembered. When it's time to retrieve, it's pretty easy. The hearing 1 will trigger you to think bun, which will trigger you to think pencil, right? It's like really easy and automatic. This technique is really handy if you're learning a list and order matters. When I was an undergrad taking physiological psych, we had to memorize the cranial nerves. And instead of using the peg word technique, which is what I wish we had done, because that includes order, the cranial nerves are numbered. We tried to make up a story, and our story did not help me. I couldn't remember the nerves very well, and in fact, I so desperately couldn't remember them, I still don't remember them. I can't remember how many there are. I feel like there's 12, but I don't know. That's horrible. I should have memorized it, and I should have used the peg word technique. But instead, we did a more organizational strategy. Instead of using visualization, we did an organizational strategy. Chunking is an example of organization. I already mentioned that earlier for enhancing short-term memory, but you can use it for long-term memory also. You can, instead of remembering 16 individual numbers, you can chunk them into 4, meaningful numbers from history, and that makes them a lot more memorable. So if you can chunk information, you can make it, it makes it into fewer things to remember and enhances the likelihood that you'll remember them. Acronyms are a type of organization. So acronyms, by the way, you have to turn it into a pronounceable word. So HOMES is an acronym. FBI is not an acronym. That's called an initialization. That's not an acronym, unless you start calling it FUBI or something, but we don't do that. HOMES is an acronym. So it takes the first letter of each of the Great Lakes and makes it into a word, and then you can remember the names of the Great Lakes. Roy G. Biv, if you learned this for the rainbow, allows you to remember the colors. So I heard that they're talking about violet not really being a color in the rainbow, and that would just really mess up our whole thing. So I hope they don't do that. Hierarchical organization. This is what I use in these slides. I'm the queen of the organizational strategy, and I love a good hierarchy. So like outlines are hierarchical. You'll notice that my banner at the top of each slide always is consistently reminding you what category we're still in, things like that. It's kind of this kind of structure. If you did like an overarching outline of what I've got here or a visualization, you'd recognize I have like a title, memory, and then I have like the breakdown, encoding, retrieval, and then underneath them, the different parts. So something I didn't mention in the organization is you can make up a story, and that's what we did wrong on my attempt to memorize the cranial nerves, is that we took the first letter of each of the cranial nerves, turned it into an actual word that then we could use in a story. We made up a story, which I can't remember, and I say we because I was in a group of, study group. We made up a story. I don't remember the story. There are 2 cranial nerves that both start with an H. that was not a good idea. That was not a good idea. The cranial nerves have numbers. We should have used the peg word technique. So if you're going to use a mnemonic device to try and enhance memory, it really makes a lot of sense to make sure that your mnemonic device is the appropriate one for the kind of material you're trying to recall. All right. Let's take a break here, and we'll come back and talk about storage and retrieval.